take a couple of minutes here and talk about initial device configuration. We've done some configurations throughout this course. This is if we have a brand new device, either a router or a switch. And setup is a command that we can use. We can set it up, or we can do what's called interactive, where we actually go in and type the stuff. And hopefully by now even you wouldn't need to use the setup mode, but we'll look at it anyway. The other is auto install, which takes some significant setup to do, and we'll look at the process, and then we'll go in to a device and look at the setup command, or what happens when a device starts up and there's no initial configuration, as well as how to configure, and then how we're going to check to be sure that our configuration is in fact there. So in configurations, we'll talk about two features. We have a setup with a manual method, manual process. Interactive, where we go into the user prompt, the greater than sign, type enable en, and then config t, configure terminal. In order to do this, we would have to have connected a device, a machine, to the router using the console port and the rollover cable in order to be able to communicate with the device, the router or the switch, and make some modifications to it. If we have not put any configurations into a device, this is going to be automatic if there's no startup configuration file. Two types of configuration files: the running config, which is in memory, and the startup configuration, which is stored in NVRAM. And we run this from privilege exec mode also. We enable, and then the configuration config t. Auto install, it automatically downloads the configuration file, but that means that we have to have a configuration file somewhere, and it can be from a local or a remote location. This is where we're going to use a lot of the infrastructure devices that we've talked about. A DHCP, DNS, TFTP will all be involved in that. Setup mode, the prerequisites: have to have a console connection using a rollover cable. Then we need a list of interfaces to configure, the IP addresses and the subnet masks that we're going to use on the interfaces. And since it's a router, all of those interfaces need to be on different IP networks, IP subnets. We need to know which routing protocols we're going to configure. If we're going to configure dynamic routing protocols, we're going to configure RIP, EIGRP, OSPF. How many, what are they going to be? We'll look at the things that are required to do those routing protocols, but which ones are going to be configured. And then it says here, by default, the devices will have no initial configuration. They will have nothing in them. It'll automatically go into setup mode at startup if there is no configuration file in it. And here are a couple of configuration hints. A couple of commands. At the privilege exec mode, use the no IP domain lookup. What that tells it to do is don't try to resolve commands into DNS names. What will happen, and you've seen that I make mistake after mistake after mistake, if you type an incorrect command, in a lot of cases it's going to try to resolve that to a DNS name, a fully qualified domain name. So you just have to wait for it. If you do that and you want to give the break command, the Cisco break, like the Control-C in Windows, is Control-Shift-6, all pressed simultaneously, and then X. Logging synchronous is another command, and that's at line con 0. The reason that we want to do that is so that if we're typing in a command and we get a console message, the console message without this will break the command into separate lines, which gets really confusing. If that happens to you, just keep typing. But logging synchronous will keep those lines intact so that we don't have that disturbance. The prerequisites for auto install, which are going to be significant. The no configuration file, not such a big deal in NVRAM, which means it's a brand new device, no configuration file, which would, if we did it manually, would go into the setup mode. The configuration file that we want to load on the networking device using the auto install is going to reside on a TFTP server that's connected to the network. So in most cases there is more than one file. For example, a network file with an IP to host name mappings in the device specific configuration file. The IP to host name so that it can find its name when it's looking for its configuration file. Someone at the remote site to connect the device to the network and turn it on so that the auto install can begin. To the network powered on. The network has IP connectivity necessary to permit the networking device to load the configuration files. Do we have connectivity? Can we get from point A to point B in order to get these files that we're now going to download to our new device, our router or switch? Router specifically. DHCP server is available to provide the IP address to the networking devices that are using auto install over the LAN connection. So we have those requirements. Here's kind of the same thing, but kind of a step-by-step. Here we have a console terminal with a terminal connection to our new router in here. Router A sends a DHCP request out its attached Ethernet 0 interface. Router B, the staging router, forwards the request to router D. And router D over here has the DHCP server. I'm going to try to scroll on this again. So the router A sends its request out, broadcast. So router B is going to be a relay. So it's going to relay the DHCP to the DHCP server. DHCP server sends back the reply, so we get our IP address after we go through the DORA process. The reply contains a temporary IP address for the E0 and an IP address and the IP address of the TFTP server. So we have the TFTP, because without its address, we're not going to find our configuration file. The network configuration file downloaded from the TFTP server does not contain an IP address to hostname mapping for router's A new IP address, so router A sends out a DNS request forwarded by router B to acquire its new hostname. So it is now going to find out what its name is. Router A uses its hostname to send a unicast request to the TFTP server for the host specific configuration file, router 1 configure, whatever we have named it, using the address that we got in step 3 up here, step 3 from the DHCP server. The config file is loaded into the running configuration for router A, and the new configuration has a permanent IP address, so that router A releases the lease address from the DHCP server using the DHCP release message. So, as I said, kind of a complex setup in order to do that. If you've got a lot of routers, probably a good idea. If you've got one, not so much. Verifying the initial configuration, the interfaces are operating correctly. The following: show interfaces command, show IP interface brief. I'm going to do a demo and we will do those things. The show configuration command, the startup and the running configuration command. Complete and verify the configuration. We can configure the router for specific functions, whatever we want to do with it. More configuration files is really what that's saying. So as a summary, the configuration files are needed to make the device useful. That's where our IP address names and the routing protocols are going to be running on it are going to be. They don't have any configuration initially. two methods are the setup, either the step-by-step or the interactive or setup that we're going to use. And then we have auto install, which required some significant configuration. And once we are configured, we need to verify the configuration. I'm going to stop with the PowerPoint and bring up my packet tracer and do a little bit of demo here on this on configuration. A basic setup here, just to look at some configurations. You notice we have the router here, and it has a red dot, and the red dot's because the interfaces are initially down. This is the back side. We can turn it off and turn it on, and what we're going to get when we start up is, since there is no system configuration file and a whole bunch of stuff up here about compliance and all of that, summary of the U.S. laws, and if we require further assistance, and this is for export, get a hold of Cisco and they'll help you out. But we're going to say yes initially. Let's say yes. We're going to enter this thing. Would you like to enter the basic management? Yes. And the name of the router was going to make it demo. The enable secret password is the hashed password that we're going to use to be able to get into privilege exec enable mode. By default, most of the passwords on Cisco are going to be unencrypted, but not this one. And I'm going to call it the very secure secret is what we'll do it. And then the enable password. Two passwords to get into the enable mode or the privilege exec mode. One of them is the enable mode, which is used if there is no enable secret. If we have an enable secret password, then the enable password isn't used. So we'll use the ever secure password, and this is the VTY. We're going to use the same one. The VTY is the telnet password, the virtual terminal password. I'm not going to configure SNMP, and in this case the management interface, and we're enter an interface name, and we'll do VLAN 1 in order to do the management interface. Configure the IP address 192.168.17.1. The please answer okay, yes. Configure yes 192.168.17. Well, now the IP address and the subnet mask, yeah, we'll take the default. We can just hit enter there. That's it. We can now go to the iOS command prompt without saving it, return back, or we can save the configuration in NVRAM. So let's save the configuration in NVRAM, and it's configured from console. If we have the password here, and let's try a password, PASSWORD. It's not effective. Secret. The secret password is the one that works. And if we do the show run, this is what a hash of secret looks like. This is an MD5 hash that's doing that. The enable password here, clear text. And if we go on down, the VTY password here is again clear text. So that's the setup mode. If we want to get rid of this, let's do a right erase and get rid of that and do a reload, and we'll confirm it. And if we get to the startup and we've decided that we don't want to use this interactive initial configuration, we can just type no, and we get to the command prompt and then enable. If we do a show run, then there's nothing there. The reason that the passwords are not encrypted is this command right here, no service password encryption. So we can go here. We have all of the nothing configured on this thing. So what we want to do is to do some basic config. The hints was the first thing that says in privilege exec mode is to do a no IP domain lookup. I think it's in config mode. No IP there either. I guess I just can't type, but it should be here, no IP, and if we do a question mark, space, and then we have domain lookup here. Domain lookup enables the DNS system no IP domain lookup. You see, I had to get to something that was specific. We had domain-name, but domain lookup will enable that. The other thing that we talked about doing is going to line con 0 and do logging synchronous. So that tab works pretty good. And if we do Control Z here to do some other configurations, let's do config T and let's go to interface, fast Ethernet 0/0 IP address 192.168.2.2 255.255.255.0. We're just doing some configurations. No shut. And it tells me that the line protocol changed state to up. So we've got a little bit of configuration here. We can go, let's do host name, demo here again to just have some information. You notice that when I typed host name demo, the next line comes up with the name of the router is now demo. We have to go to the enable mode, user privilege exec mode. I keep wanting to say user privilege exec mode in order to see these things. So we can show the running configuration file. When we go down through here, we don't have any passwords. You can see that we have the interface. If fast Ethernet 00, the duplex is auto, the speed is auto in it, and it does not have the shutdown command, whereas fast Ethernet 01 does. So the default is with the interfaces shut down. I took the configuration out when I did the write erase, and so VLAN 1, the one that we had configured, isn't there anymore. And we don't have anything here, but here we do have logging synchronous on this one. If we use the show IP interface brief, we show the status here. The first up is a physical connectivity, and the second is a layer 2 connectivity. And when we have an interface that we want to be up, we're always going to be looking for an up configuration here. If I show interfaces, we get an awful lot more information. Here we have the IP address, the MAC address, bandwidth, delay, what kind of reliability we're having, any kind of errors that we would have on this particular interface. The same for fast Ethernet 01. Here it says it's administratively down, the line protocol is down, it's disabled. Up here, the line protocol is up, connected, and in Ethernet the line protocol is up when it's connected, and we give it the no shut command. So some of the commands that we can use to check our configurations. What we would want to do now, because if we show start is not there, we want to copy running config to startup config so that when we reload the router, it goes down, somebody turns it off, trips over the power cord, whatever else, our configuration that we just did is saved to the startup config file. It says building the configuration, and then we're okay. Now we can show start, and it is there. One of the, I guess, advantages of this, if you're doing configurations and you make a really big mistake, just restart the router without saving the configuration. That way, the old configuration, you will have lost everything that you've typed in, obviously, but the old configuration will be the ones that will reload because it's in the startup config. But that's a brief overview of configuring the initial configuration of the device, as well as how to check to be sure it's there. The IP address is there, the interface is up, those sorts of things. The next thing that we're going to look at is configure, verify, troubleshoot basic device hardening. We're going to look at local authentication and making those passwords more secure. See you there.